When Sandy Morris picks up his guitar, do you hear that note of R&B? Well, it all started here on the north shore of Quidi Vidi Lake. It's been home to an ornate hotel, killer parties, and concerts that changed the course of music in Newfoundland and Labrador. The first real parties on the lake were thrown by an eccentric man named Professor Charles Danielle.
If you were having a party in St. John's, you wanted to have Professor Danielle there.
He was born in Maryland in the 1830s and showed up mysteriously in St. John's some 30 years later.
He's a real entrepreneur. Like, he's a dance teacher, he's a restaurateur, he's someone really engaged with the whole community. So initially when he arrives in St. John's, he sees two buildings in Bannerman Park and he says, oh, this is an opportunity. And so one of the buildings he uses for dance. And so people from all over the town would show up at the Princess in Bannerman Park and they would take dance lessons from Professor Danielle. And in the other building, that was his costume building. People would actually rent the costumes to go into the park to dance and, to skate, whatever the activity might be.
When his operations in Bannerman Park burnt to the ground, Professor Danielle left the island, only to return a decade later. Standing on the gangplank of his boat, he asked, "Is the fire out?" This time, he had his eye on Quidi Vidi Lake and built what was called a roadhouse, an elaborate building with a restaurant and rooms on the edge of town.
He built this, by all accounts, this beautiful building, and it was really quite popular. If you were going to go out to dinner, you wanted to go down there. Like, this was elaborately dressed with all kinds of oriental design and, drapes and, really quite elegant. And that's where you would want to go, that if you were of any means in St. John's. Everything worked out, it was going fabulous. But then the guy who was renting him the property thought, maybe I could make a little bit more, so he jacked up the rent.
The Royal Pavilion was probably in this stretch of right here.
Hilda Murray has written about the history of farming around Quidi Vidi Lake. She's interviewed descendants of Joseph Ross, the man who rented the land to Danielle.
They didn't get along, and the professor complained of vandalism from his neighbors, and Ross said that he was getting rent of $12 a year. The rent was $12 a year, and he said that wasn't enough to keep 2 goats alive. Things went from bad to worse.
He was a big personality, very spontaneous. He went into a fury and he said, well, no, this is not going to happen. So that big, beautiful roadhouse, that restaurant, he actually had it taken down board by board, and he put it on the train and he moved out to what we now refer to as Octagon Pond, so out in Topsail. And that's where he built what we now refer to as the Octagon Castle.
That wasn't the end of the parties on the North Shore, though. The Royal Newfoundland Regiment had training camps there during the Great War, and at night they'd pile into the mess tent for quite the time.
They would have what they refer to in the day as smoking parties. So essentially a smoking party is a bunch of men gathering and drinking. Now, it comes out of an Old English tradition where they would gather in very fine rooms and they would smoke and discuss philosophy. But in terms of the Quidi Vidi experience of that, what was happening was that these men would gather under tents, and it was really all about the drinking and all about the dancing and all about the music. And those smoking parties, especially throughout the First World War, huge numbers would gather under those tents.
Early in the Second World War, the Americans built the Fort Pepperell base, designed in the shape of a cowboy hat. The parties got even wilder.
The base here had its own military band, And a lot of those musicians, filtered down through into the community and ended up playing. Plus, they had their own radio station, VOUS, which broadcast not what you were hearing on local radio stations. The first time I heard James Brown was on VOUS. And they'd play like blues guys like Buddy Guy and B.B. King, and like I say, it just wasn't on commercial radio. So like we heard stuff that like blew our minds that we'd never even thought existed in the world. And then the first time I ever felt high, a natural high from listening to music, was listening to Booker T and the MGs on VOUS from here. It captivated me, and it still does to this day. Some of the way I play those Newfoundland songs were directly influenced by the R&B that I heard as a kid, no question about it, because I tried to find different grooves, but underneath the Newfoundland tunes. They used to have these big shows touring all the bases everywhere, all over the world. So as part of that, I think Frank Sinatra was here one time, and you'd have all sorts of stars, everybody you could think of, basically. And it was a huge place. Musicians loved to play there because the beer was so cheap, 25 cents a beer.
They weren't just going to see the Americans play, they were jamming and forming bands with them too.
We ended up playing with a lot of these American guys. I played in a band called, originally the Ambassadors, with a guy named Tony Gaines from New York City, and he was a professional singer in New York City, and he ended up singing here with us. When he got out of the service, he moved back here so he could stay with the band, and that became the Garrison Hill, which was, at the time, the hugest band on the island. Right? The whole musical community was influenced, because then you'd be passing that influence on to the next crowd.
Today, the tradition continues. Crowds pack the Iceberg Alley tents for music and dancing and fun, just like the old days.
These tents are put up and essentially on the same location and for the same purpose. So it's like history is always repeating itself. Quidi Vidi was always a place to come to, gather, go for a leisurely walk. We still do that. Quidi Vidi was a place to come to for sports. We still do that. We come to regatta every year.
And every other day of the year too. Walkers, joggers, bird watchers, kids playing soccer, rain or shine. 200 years from now, who will be walking these shores? Who will be the characters in their stories? What will the lake look like then, or the city that surrounds it? The future's history is happening right now, down at the lake.